Big Four Risk Advisory, Interview Preparation. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into risk advisory interview preparation used across Big Four consulting teams. These questions come from real interview patterns across global Big Four risk, internal audit, and ERM practices. Risk advisory focuses on identifying enterprise risks, evaluating controls, strengthening governance, and helping organizations build resilient risk management frameworks. Let's begin. How do you perform an enterprise-wide risk assessment for a large organization with multiple business units? Sample answer. I begin by identifying the universe of risks across strategic, operational, financial, compliance, and technology areas. I meet key stakeholders across business units to capture top-down and bottom-up risks. Then I assess likelihood, impact, and velocity using a consistent scoring model. I consolidate risks into a heat map and validate with leadership before finalizing the ERM register. While answering, always talk about structured approach, stakeholder input, scoring model, and risk heat map. A client wants to align its risk management framework with ISO 31000. How do you approach the gap assessment? Sample answer. I compare the client's existing risk governance, risk processes, and reporting with ISO 31000 principles: context, identification, evaluation, treatment, and monitoring. I highlight gaps in risk appetite, documentation, and ownership. Then I build a roadmap to align processes, templates, and governance with ISO standards. While answering, always talk about framework comparison, gap identification, governance alignment, and roadmap creation. How do you identify key risks during stakeholder interviews and process walkthroughs? Sample answer. I prepare targeted questions for each function, review process flows, and observe real-time activities. I map risks to steps where errors, delays, overrides, or dependencies occur. I validate risks with data and examples shared by stakeholders. While answering, always talk about interviews, process mapping, evidence validation, and risk articulation. A business reports rapid growth. How do you reassess risk exposure in a high-growth environment? Sample answer. High growth changes the risk landscape. I assess scalability gaps, talent capacity, system robustness, control maturity, and governance oversight. I evaluate new risks arising from expansion, speed, and stretched processes. Then I refresh the risk register and recommend upgraded controls. While answering, always talk about scalability, control maturity, new risk emergence, and updated risk register. Updated risk register. How do you evaluate whether existing controls adequately mitigate identified risks? Sample answer. I assess control design first. Does it prevent or detect the risk? Then I test operating effectiveness through samples, walkthroughs, and evidence. I evaluate coverage, frequency, and automation level. Gaps lead to remediation recommendations. While answering, always talk about design versus operating effectiveness, testing, coverage, and remediation. A client has no formal risk register. How do you design one from scratch? Sample answer. I define risk categories, rating scales, ownership structure, and reporting format. I capture risks from interviews, documents, and analytics. I assign owners, treatments, and timelines. The result is a standardized, enterprise-wide register. While answering, always talk about structure, categorization, ownership, and documentation. How do you determine risk appetite and tolerance for a company that has never defined them? Sample answer. I work with leadership to understand strategic priorities, financial thresholds, regulatory expectations, and operational capacity. I translate these into qualitative and quantitative statements for each risk category. Tolerance bands help define acceptable deviation levels. While answering, always talk about leadership alignment, qualitative plus quantitative thresholds, and tolerance setting, OLV. A company is exposed to geopolitical risks. How do you evaluate and prioritize such external risks? Sample answer. I analyze country exposures, regulatory shifts, supply chain dependencies, and political volatility indicators. I assess impact on operations, cost, and continuity. Prioritization considers velocity and probability of disruption. While answering, always talk about external scanning, dependency mapping, impact analysis, and prioritization. How do you perform control testing for a process with heavy manual interventions? Sample answer. I identify manual touchpoints, sample high-risk transactions, and test whether controls consistently operate as intended. I evaluate documentation reliability and segregation of duties. Manual processes require larger sample sizes and deeper walkthroughs. While answering, always talk about manual touchpoints, sampling, documentation, and SOD risks. A client reports recurring control failures. How do you conduct root cause analysis? Sample answer. I analyze patterns, which locations, which processes, and which people are involved. I use 5 why or fishbone techniques to identify design versus execution issues. I validate root causes with data and propose sustainable fixes. While answering, always talk about pattern analysis, RCA tools, validation, and sustainable remediation. How do you assess risks in emerging areas like AI, data privacy, and cybersecurity? Sample answer. I evaluate data governance, algorithm transparency, regulatory exposure, cyber posture, and incident readiness. I map emerging risks to traditional frameworks so they fit into ERM programs. While answering, always talk about technology risks, governance, regulatory exposure, and mapping to ERM. A business is migrating to cloud systems. How do you evaluate new risks introduced by cloud adoption? Sample answer. I identify risks around data security, vendor dependence, access controls, integration failures, and business continuity. I assess whether contractual SLAs, encryption, monitoring, and backups mitigate the risks. While answering, always talk about cloud risks, vendor controls, security measures, and continuity planning. How do you design and implement a 3 lines of defense model for a client? Sample answer. I define roles. Business owns risks, line 1. Risk compliance oversees, line 2. And internal audit provides independent assurance, line 3. I create policies, reporting lines, and escalation workflows aligned to this structure. While answering, always talk about role clarity, governance, escalation, and oversight. A company experiences frequent operational disruptions. How do you assess business continuity risks? Sample answer. I conduct BIA to identify critical processes, recovery time objectives, and dependencies. I assess backup systems, alternate sites, and crisis protocols. Gaps form the basis of resilience improvements. While answering, always talk about BIA, dependencies, RTO, RPO, and resilience planning. How do you evaluate the adequacy of risk ownership across departments? Sample answer. I check whether every risk has a clear owner, accountability level, and performance expectation. I assess whether owners have authority, resources, and reporting mechanisms to manage risks effectively. While answering, always talk about accountability, authority, resources, and reporting. A process shows high residual risk despite multiple controls. How do you reassess control design? Sample answer. I test whether controls address root causes, whether frequency or scope is insufficient, or if controls are detective instead of preventive. Sometimes the risk requires redesigning processes or adding automation. While answering, always talk about root cause, control design gaps, frequency, and process redesign. How do you assess governance maturity during a risk advisory engagement? Sample answer. I review board oversight, committee structures, decision-making processes, policy quality, and communication flows. I compare maturity with best practice frameworks. While answering, always talk about governance pillars, benchmark comparison, evidence, and maturity scoring. A client wants to implement ERM software. How do you evaluate suitable tools and features? Sample answer. I gather functional needs, risk register, workflows, dashboards, KRI tracking. I evaluate tools on usability, integration, scalability, and reporting. I run demos and assess governance fit. While answering, always talk about requirements, features, integration, and governance alignment. How do you map risks to KPIs and performance metrics for better monitoring? Sample answer. I link each risk to KPIs that show early signals. For example, attrition risk to attrition rate, credit risk to overdue debt, cyber risk to incident count. KRIs are designed to forecast issues early. While answering, always talk about linkage, leading indicators, thresholds, and monitoring. A company operates in a highly regulated industry. How do you evaluate compliance risks? Sample answer. I review applicable laws, map obligations to processes, and test controls mitigating compliance failures. I assess monitoring mechanisms and escalation protocols. While answering, always talk about regulatory mapping, control testing, monitoring, and escalation. How do you assess culture and tone at the top as part of risk maturity evaluation? Sample answer. I review leadership communication, ethics policies, survey results, whistleblower trends, and reinforcement mechanisms. Culture often determines control effectiveness. While answering, always talk about leadership behavior, ethics, evidence, and correlation with controls. A client is undergoing digital transformation. How do you assess associated transformation risks? Sample answer. I analyze risks in change management, data migration, process redesign, user access, and project governance. I also assess whether benefits realization plans exist. While answering, always talk about project governance, data risk, change impact, and controls. How do you carry out fraud risk assessment for procurement and vendor management? Sample answer. I identify fraud schemes, collusion, kickbacks, inflated pricing, duplicate vendors. I evaluate red flags and test controls like vendor onboarding, approvals, and audits. While answering, always talk about fraud schemes, red flags, controls, and analytics. A company has inconsistent risk reporting across units. How do you harmonize frameworks? Sample answer. I standardize terminology, scoring, templates, and reporting frequency. I train teams and embed governance so risk reporting stays consistent. While answering, always talk about standardization, training, governance, and consistency. How do you assess risks related to third-party and vendor relationships? Sample answer. I evaluate vendor criticality, dependency risk, financial health, contract gaps, cyber exposure, and compliance posture. I assign vendor risk ratings and build monitoring plans. While answering, always talk about vendor criticality, due diligence, contract controls, and monitoring. A business uses multiple outsourced service providers. How do you evaluate outsourcing risks? Sample answer. I review vendor contracts, SLAs, performance reports, incident logs, and dependency levels. I evaluate concentration risks, operational resilience, and data protection. I assess whether oversight, monitoring, and escalation processes are functioning as intended. While answering, always talk about contract clarity, dependency risks, oversight mechanisms, and SLA monitoring. How do you identify unknown unknowns in risk advisory engagements? Sample answer. I use external benchmarking, horizon scanning, industry trend analysis, and scenario workshops to uncover risks teens may not be aware of. I challenge assumptions and explore tail risk scenarios. While answering, always talk about horizon scanning, benchmarking, scenarios, and challenging assumptions. A client is concerned about data leakage incidents. How do you assess information security risks? Sample answer. I evaluate access controls, data classification, encryption practices, monitoring tools, vendor integrations, and incident management processes. I test actual practices versus documented IT policies. While answering, always talk about access control, data governance, monitoring, and incident response. How do you create heat maps and risk dashboards for senior leadership? Sample answer. I map risks on likelihood versus impact and add velocity indicators. Dashboards show risk trends, overdue actions, KRIs, and owner accountability. Visuals make decision-making easier. While answering, always talk about visualization, risk positioning, KRIs, and actionable insights. A regulator issues new compliance guidelines. How do you assess impact on the client's risk profile? Sample answer. I review regulatory changes, map them to processes, and assess gaps in compliance controls. I identify increased risks and recommend policy updates, training, and monitoring enhancements. While answering, always talk about regulatory mapping, gap assessment, compliance controls, and remediation. How do you evaluate the strength of internal audit function while performing a risk assessment? Sample answer. I assess audit coverage, methodology, independence, reporting quality, and follow-up mechanisms. A strong internal audit function reduces residual risk significantly. While answering, always talk about independence, coverage, methodology, and follow-up discipline. A company has outdated SOPs. How do you identify operational risks arising from process gaps? Sample answer. I compare actual practices with outdated SOPs to identify unapproved workarounds, missing controls, and inconsistent execution. These gaps form key operational risk themes. While answering, always talk about practice versus policy gaps, execution inconsistency, missing controls, and remediation. How do you assess liquidity and financial risks during volatile market conditions? Sample answer. I analyze cash flow forecasts, covenant compliance, borrowing limits, hedging strategies, and market stress scenarios. I check resilience under different volatility patterns. While answering, always talk about scenario analysis, cash flow stress, covenants, and hedging. How do you evaluate ethics and conduct risks in an organization? Sample answer. I review whistleblower trends, disciplinary actions, training records, and culture surveys. I assess incentives and pressure points that may drive misconduct. While answering, always talk about culture indicators, behavioral risks, incentives, and evidence. How do you analyze reputational risk in high-profile companies? Sample answer. I track media exposure, stakeholder perception, regulatory issues, and customer complaints. I evaluate how quickly the company responds to incidents and its crisis communication readiness. While answering, always talk about perception data, media analysis, response capability, and crisis readiness. A client wants to perform crisis management readiness assessment. How do you proceed? Sample answer. I assess crisis governance, escalation protocols, communication plans, resilience capabilities, and simulation testing. I identify gaps in coordination and leadership response. While answering, always talk about governance, simulation, escalation, and communication. How do you validate key risk indicators, KRIs, for effectiveness? Sample answer. I check whether KRIs are predictive, measurable, linked to risks, and monitored consistently. I test thresholds and evaluate whether KRIs provide early warning signals. While answering, always talk about predictiveness, measurability, linkage, and thresholds. How do you evaluate cybersecurity posture using NIST or similar frameworks? Sample answer. I assess maturity across identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. I review policies, access controls, incident logs, and resilience capabilities. Findings are mapped to NIST maturity levels. While answering, always talk about framework mapping, maturity scoring, security controls, and incident capability. A client is concerned about supply chain vulnerabilities. How do you perform supply chain risk assessment? Sample answer. I map suppliers, dependencies, geographical risks, logistics vulnerabilities, and financial health of partners. I assess disruptions, alternatives, and continuity. While answering, always talk about dependency mapping, geography risks, supplier health, and continuity. How do you incorporate ESG risks into traditional risk management frameworks? Sample answer. I classify ESG risks into environmental, social, and governance categories. I map them to existing processes and assign KRIs. I evaluate regulatory exposure and stakeholder expectations. While answering, always talk about ESG categorization, integration into regulatory drivers, and KRIs. A company faces high attrition. How do you assess people-related risks and HR controls? Sample answer. I analyze turnover data, exit interviews, skill gaps, and succession issues. I evaluate HR controls like hiring quality, onboarding, manpower planning, and engagement programs. While answering, always talk about data trends, root causes, HR controls, and capability risks. How do you assess strategic risks during major decision-making, for example, expansion, M&A? Sample answer. I analyze market conditions, financial projections, capacity limits, cultural risks, and integration challenges. I evaluate alignment with strategy and risk appetite. While answering, always talk about external factors, capacity limits, strategic fit, and risk appetite alignment. A risk owner contests your severity and likelihood scoring. How do you handle the disagreement? Sample answer. I present data, benchmarks, and past incidents supporting my scoring. I understand their perspective and recalibrate if justified. Final scoring is reached through evidence-backed consensus. While answering, always talk about evidence, stakeholder dialogue, justification, and consensus. How do you distinguish between design gaps versus execution gaps in controls? Sample answer. Design gaps mean the control itself is inadequate. Execution gaps mean the control exists but is not followed. I test documentation, process flow, and evidence to determine the nature of the gap. While answering, always talk about intent versus practice, documentation review, testing, and classification. ? How do you evaluate risk overuse of exceptions in approvals and workflows? Sample answer. I analyze exception logs, approval justifications, and patterns. Frequent exceptions indicate governance gaps or flawed process design. I recommend tightening criteria and monitoring. While answering, always talk about exception analysis, governance gaps, trends, and corrective controls. A company experiences multiple cyber alerts. How do you determine if controls are functioning effectively? Sample answer. I review alert logs, false positive ratios, response times, and escalation adherence. I assess detection rules and evaluate whether alerts correlate with genuine threats. While answering, always talk about detection quality, response metrics, escalation, and threat validation. How do you build a risk heat map that integrates financial, operational, and IT risks? Sample answer. I standardize scoring across all risk categories, classify risks into themes, and map them on a unified heat map. I add indicators like velocity or controllability for richer insights. While answering, always talk about unified scoring, categorization, visualization, and indicators. A client needs quarterly risk reporting. How do you structure an efficient reporting cadence? Sample answer. I define reporting templates, timelines, responsibilities, and KRI dashboards. I automate data collection and consolidate risk updates into governance packs. While answering, always talk about templates, cadence, automation, and governance packs. How do you assess the effectiveness of whistleblower mechanisms as part of the risk review? Sample answer. I review hotline design, anonymity guarantees, response protocols, investigation timeliness, and communication. I benchmark usage patterns with industry norms. While answering, always talk about confidentiality, responsiveness, investigation quality, and benchmarking. After completing a risk advisory engagement, how do you communicate key findings and recommendations to the board? Sample answer. I present a concise heat map, top risks, root causes, control gaps, and prioritized recommendations. I highlight business impact and quick wins. I ensure messaging is strategic, not operational. While answering, always talk about clarity, prioritization, impact focus, and board-level messaging. Ending. Thank you for watching, and if you liked our video, kindly press the like button and leave us a comment. This will help us reach a wider audience. Don't forget to check the playlist for more great learning.